Hey, I'm Booger Boy, and I spent a few hours converting the iconic opening sequence of Aang on his air scooter into pixel art, and I want to show you exactly how I did it and what I learned along the way. So, yip, let's get to pixeling. I knew I wanted to animate this once the art was complete, so I thought the best thing to do was to use at least two layer groups, one for the static background and one for Aang and his air scooter. I started with the background because I found it's easier to get a sense of your resolution once you have some big shapes and values on the canvas. In this case, the canvas is 128 by 128, and it would be really hard to know right away how big to make Aang. Even just a few pixels too big or small would be a crazy difference in the amount of details that you could include. So, like I said, I was just focusing on big shapes and silhouettes and only using a handful of values at the start. After about 15 or 20 minutes, I had a decent grayscale layer, which is really going to help with the rest of the workflow. However, I still have not mastered the element of value bending yet, so I had to go back and correct a few mistakes. If I put the piece side by side with a grayscale screenshot from the reference scene, you can see that the value of the mountains in the background actually increases as the mountains get further away. This is called atmospheric perspective, and a general description is that as things get significantly further away from the viewer, they also tend to get hazier and lose contrast. So, I reversed the value structure of my mountains to account for this atmospheric perspective, and I also fixed a few other issues with the foreground and these kind of, samurai totem statue things. They look a little bit like cats or jack-o'-lanterns to me, but this was good enough, so I decided it was time to add some colors. It took probably 5 minutes or so for everything to have a color and for this whole piece to start coming together. What I did was pick a hue on the hue slider, and then I was just approximating a saturation and a value, and it was really starting to look good in my opinion. I could have used the eyedropper tool to pick the colors directly from the reference, but that's something I only do in a pinch because I found that it doesn't work very well, and it's also not teaching me anything about how colors are constructed with the hue, saturation, and value, or how they work together on the canvas. Once I had the rough colors in place, I spent maybe 30 minutes just tinkering with the stone path. I had to overlay a kind of grid to help account for the other kind of perspective, which is called linear perspective. And this is usually what people think of when they hear perspective in art, and it's basically when things look smaller as they move away from the viewer. So this grid is helping me better understand how the size and layout of the stones is changing as they get further away and curve off screen to the right. Not only does it make placing the individual stones way easier, it also helped me accurately place these little patches and tufts of grass poking through the path, which really helped to sell that worn-in feeling. Next, I looked at the reference and did my best to convert the medium and small shapes of the mountains into pixel art form. I have a really hard time visualizing form in my head, and I haven't done nearly enough studying of rocky formations specifically, so I can't just generate those correct forms out of thin air. However, as long as your values are good and the shapes are close enough, for a background element like this, the viewer's just gonna see it out of the corner of their eye and say, hey, that looks like a mountain to me. So I didn't spend too much time getting the details absolutely perfect here. The last bit of coloring is on these mysterious totems, and the only thing I could find about them was this really obscure Game Boy Advance walkthrough video from 2012. This totem from the game looks very similar to the one in the reference, and it's also on Four Paws Island, which leads me to believe that these are indeed cat totems, so I guess that's a fun little fact. But anyways, they're looking a little flat, and the easiest way to give them some dimension is to add shadows and highlights. I also threw in a mossy green for some texture, and took a step back to see how everything was coming along. I'm really happy with the colors and the silhouettes, and especially with this one cat totem that kind of reminds me of a cat meme, so I gave this a stamp of approval and moved on to the star of the show. Well, okay, not quite yet. I made a super quick blue sphere and smushed the bottom to give it more of a feeling like Aang was riding it around, and then I put him on top, sitting crisscross applesauce. At this resolution, I could only put the most recognizable features in, like the colors of his robes, the iconic blue arrows, and of course a huge smile. There's really not much room for perfect facial anatomy or intricate folds in the fabric or any other granular detail like that. This is actually one of my favorite things about the constraints in pixel art. You're forced to make some big design decisions, and you also really don't need to be a technical master to make something that looks good. It took me probably 10 minutes to go from nothing to an Aang that I was ready to start animating. And on that note, I have been doing pixel art for a little over 2 years, and I've probably only ever animated like less than 5 things. I want to eventually get into the really complex stuff like video game animation or fight scenes, but for now I went with a really simple 6-frame loop, and it's actually just a 3-frame loop with some minor differences between the two halves to sell Aang bobbing up and down on his air scooter. Now, I want to be clear that I have nothing insightful to say about animation right now. I spent probably an hour and a half on the actual art piece, and then another 2 hours just trying to figure out how do I get these 6 frames looking somewhat decent. Let's take a look at the full time lapse before concluding. For me, this piece really reinforced how important it is to use a reference. If I didn't have a reference, my values would be messed up, this path would look terrible, and I probably wouldn't even have finished this art. So if you take one thing away from this video, it should be to use a reference. And the other thing you should take away is that I know nothing about animation. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this pixel art process video. Take care.